Welcome to Markigy, the science of marketing strategy, a bi-weekly podcast where all the cool marketers discuss their favorite marketing strategies, study by study. On this show, we feature marketing risk takers who believe long-term wins for the customer equal long-term wins for the business too. How? Human-led marketing, the combination of where science, creativity, and strategy meet, or as we also like to call it, Markigy. Let's break down the marketing trends, myths, and methodologies together. I'm your host, Leanne Dowweimer. Let's go. Good morning. This is Leanne Dowweimer with Markigy, and I'm joined by Julio Bermúdez. He is the CRO at Mutiny. He has a long history of experience in B2B SaaS. I would call him an expert and an investor and a wonderful advisor. Julio, thank you so much for joining me. I'd love to hear from you. Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for the intro. Very humbling. It definitely has been some time since I've been working in the digital product space. So I started off kind of my career working on an A/B testing company. So we kind of helped launch a company called Optimize. A lot of people by now probably have heard about it. But when I started, it was just a small group of us, kind of like in an apartment in San Francisco, truly cliche kind of startup story. But we started off by really thinking about how to, make data-driven decision making. And Dan Soroka, the CEO, came off the Obama campaign and had this vision, and that's where I kind of got my start. And so really cut my teeth on kind of helping marketers and product teams become more data-driven. And then that kind of continued on into working for a couple companies, most notably recently Amplitude, where we literally help people make decisions with data. Actually, a lot of similar people came through from Optimize to the Amplitude. And again, really what it was is a passion for helping people build products in a way that's really data-driven and helping marketers, truly make that leap from like sort of the sales-led area, marketing-led era into this now product-led era. And so that's what brought me to where I am today.
Awesome. I love the blend of creativity, science, and facts, right? And how they all intertwine. And that's kind of what we're about here at Markigy. And so kind of that brings us to the next part of how they all blend together is, can you explain to us what Mutiny is and maybe kind of tone it down like we're five, but just tell us about like the ingredients and what makes it so special.
Yeah, so Mutiny's a pretty cool company. I just recently joined. I guess now it's been about 4 or 5 months. Time has flown by really fast. We're having a lot of fun over here. But essentially what Mutiny helps people do is personalize their websites. And so what we want to do is be the centralized location for your marketing team to be able to personalize content to your audiences. And so, of course, a lot of people have different audiences serving different segments, especially now it's really, really important because, people are starting to flock towards maybe a more refined, ICP because they're seeing things like churn and, all different types of effects from the macro. And so people are now starting to be really targeted with their spend. And that's what essentially Mutiny allows you to do, which is drive efficient growth. So I was really excited to joining. I joined in the craziest time, of course, to be a chief revenue officer, where it's like, all of a sudden the world's upside down and money is very expensive. And so, people are really scrutinizing spend. But that's sort of the ethos here at Mutiny, which is to drive efficient marketing growth. And the way you do that, of course, is through data. So that's a little bit about Mutiny.
Awesome. So I like how you really touched on the different types of ICPs, because in an earlier episode, we talked about how you can personalize something based on a self-selection process for like, e-commerce and things like that. But when it comes to other kinds of personalization, we haven't talked on that as much. So what are some ways that Mutiny kind of like helps an organization and their website be personalized? Like, is it just like, from my experience with it, is it takes it beyond just the, hey, Leanne, you're on my website, right? Like it's more sophisticated than that. Could you talk to us about that part?
Yeah. So in the same vein as like a really refined, ICP, we specifically are selling personalization to B2B companies. And I think that's a really important distinction because B2C personalization is its own hairy beast. I've tried to attack that a couple times in my career. It's really difficult. I think AI is really going to help with the scale problem. Happy to talk about that further later in the episode if you like. Double click on that. But essentially, what we're doing is really targeting people that are selling to other companies. So number one, you kind of have a better idea of what will work and what techniques will help people personalize. Number two, an ICP is actually even more important. I don't want to say more important, but it's extremely important in a B2B sense. Like in the way I described, let's say that we're a company and we have, sort of an SMB or mid-market motion. Those companies are under financial distress right now. A lot of them are closing business. They're, having issues paying their bills, or they're just scrutinizing, trying to save cash so they can make it through, maybe 2024, 2025 to fundraise again. And those types of companies may not be the best customers. And so when we're talking about ICP, it's like, okay, great. Well, is there part of your customer base that you see in your data that doesn't churn? It's sticky, has a high NDR, so net dollar retention, somebody that's really making your firm money, like go get more of those, right? And the problem with the all-seeing eye from LinkedIn and Google is that, you're able to target people, but, essentially once they come to your website, it might as well say anything, or, maybe if you have something that's like a CMS that lets you do something cheesy, like, hey, Leanne, right? Like that's not really effective. What's effective is getting the right content. And so what Mutiny allows people to do is to take a look at that visitor, understand who they are. And we have a couple of proprietary ways where we do that. And then we're able to serve up content to them. Now that content can be generated by you as a marketer, or you can utilize generative AI. And that's another really big part of our company, where we're actually helping marketers come up with the best copy utilizing generative AI. And we also help companies think through, what part of your website should be personalized based on that type of visitor. And we have all that data from our other customers. And so essentially it's like having like an entire AI, marketing team kind of help you, figure out what to do. And then we have the ability to, identify users with high resolution in order to make sure it's relevant for them.
Awesome. I mean, and that's not to be like a total, zealot, but like, that's what I love about this specifically is because one of the things that pisses me off is like when you have all this ad spend and you're doing all this effort to get like that kind of connection and get them to try to convert to your website. And then, a lot of times I've been in the position where I'm like, look, I got you traffic, but what did you do with that traffic? Like, did you convert your traffic? Like, that wasn't under my umbrella. Yeah. And so, something like this, I think is where it really creates a better feeling process for the buyer also, because, we know that it's going to take them a gazillion or so touches, right? Generously speaking, in order to move forward in their buying process. And so when they're able to get the content they need and they want, and it's served up, my understanding is that would decrease the the buying cycle because they're able to get what they need faster, which, and then also it uplifts the traffic that you do get and the conversion rates there.
Totally. And I think that a lot of the way people, previously have thought about it was that like the money that we spend, like at the end of the day, like as long as we're within certain, costs of, acquisition, we're fine. But you're right. Nobody's paying attention to the conversion. Like we were yelling this off the rooftops 10, 12 years ago, 2011 at I was like, look at what the date is, 2023 right now. But, that's something that's been, it's taken a decade to get to the point now where people are really A/B testing quite frequently. But even still, people aren't necessarily A/B testing just basic stuff, or what they're thinking about is just simply increasing, conversion rates, right? Which is definitely important because you want to make sure that you're growing. But one thing that's also really important is that people that are coming to your website at all different parts of the life cycle. So even if you're spending the money and you're getting them to come in, they may not be in a buying cycle. They may already be a customer even. And depending on the content. So I'll tell you a quick story, right? So we were looking at two different tools. One of the people on my customer success team was like, hey, I'm thinking about, buying this tool A, and we had, some tool B, right? And so I go to the website for, tool B, and it didn't speak to me in any way about the problems we had right? It was basically a generic website. And it took me like 2-3 minutes to be like, okay, where's our use case? Do they actually help serve that? And like, I didn't have time to sit there, right, and do that. So I basically was like, okay, cool. I guess they don't do it. And so then we churned off their contract and we bought a new tool, right? And the whole reason why was because I couldn't find the relevant information fast enough. And now that may sound punitive, but that's what's happening right now is that you're sitting there and everybody's looking at their budgets and looking at these line items and looking for where to cut. And you don't want your company to be one of those things that gets cut. So it helps growth, not only from an acquisition side, but I'm a zealot about retention. So you might hear me come back to retention like a million times.
Yeah, but I mean, like, that's the point is that it's cheaper to acquire and keep a customer than it is to churn them. And yeah, if you're just going to try to grow through acquisition, it's going to be very, very, very hard to grow. And you're going to have to do what marketers have been doing in the past 2 years, which is throwing ungodly amounts of money at, Google, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And that just doesn't sustain, as we see now that money is like not as cheap. Yeah, I mean, it was never sustainable. But I kind of want to come back to something you said about it being punitive. And I think that one thing is that, that self-serve, now we are in a different generation, a different style, different communication. The world is more connected globally. And so there is an expectation of the information that you're searching for to be readily available at our fingertips. We were kind of the first people that grew up with like Ask Jeeves, Ask Google. And so we're trained to just tippity tap looking for an answer and then get it back in milliseconds. And that's something that, I think going forward is just going to become more and more of a bench, expectations to start off with. And so, it really is how business is done now, without any fault, but it's sophisticated more now. So we've kind of talked about a couple things. You mentioned, AI, you mentioned data-driven. One thing was that, for me, it's easy to be like, duh, of course, this is a great idea. But what are some ways that maybe like I would miss out, or some nuance that makes this, a more sustainable, long-term, customer-centric strategy that is just below the surface? Yeah. So again, like if we take a step back and just, back off maybe the paid spend example I gave, which is pretty, linear and pretty specific. And we think back to how can we help companies serve their customers better? The first thing you want to do is you need to understand who they are and what they're doing and why they're there, right? And so we used to be able to do that pretty easily through UTM parameters and things like that. But increasingly now AI is actually deciding what copy is even going out there that's attractive. So now as somebody who's a marketer, people are coming to my website and I may not even, at least at first glance, without doing some analysis, really even understand what was it that they clicked on that caused them to come. Now, it's not to say that we can't have attribution. I mean, literally, what was the tagline? And the reason why is not based on the campaign, but it's so that I can have a similar tagline on my website. And that's not possible, right? So we can do attribution right now, but we can't quickly identify someone, understand what they clicked on, and then, immediately serve them up relevant content. And so again, if you go back to my example where I was a customer, right, and I'm looking to either spend more money or to churn, or, I'm starting to wanting to engage in some sort of like contracting conversation, I was not served properly, right? And so I was not the center of that. I was getting a generic thing. And so I think that what's really important, when you think about something like Mutiny, is that it's not just about how do we, just get new customers, but it's like, how are we actually serving them in their life cycle? And that's something that I used to talk a lot about at Amplitude, was sort of like the death of the funnel, where like that acquisition funnel was, increasingly getting expensive. And even if you acquire them, you're not actually paying attention to the bottom, which is like once they get into your product, and then how do they expand over time? Because like what you described is like, the change in what people are expecting. People are now expecting, like people are having a hard time catching up to even just like the online marketing driven world where everything needs to be instantaneous. And, the fact that business apps are now look like consumer apps, and we have all these tastes and preferences for things to work quickly. But there's also the entire concept that the product itself now needs to be the number one salesperson, needs to be the number one marketing person, right? You're not necessarily just speaking to them on a website. And so once you get
past that initial acquisition is when life really begins, with your company, at least if you're a SaaS company. But even if you're not a SaaS company, I would argue that every business is becoming a recurring business. You can look at Amazon. They pioneered this. When I had my first baby, I ordered diapers and Amazon's like, do you want a subscription? It's like, yeah, great. Now I am contributing to ARR, right? Or MRR, however you measure it at your company, right? And so they don't want to churn me. They don't want to lose me, right? Volvo, you can now actually subscribe to a car. We called it leasing back in the day, but they'll now let you change your car every month, right? BMW doing that. Tesla, you can actually subscribe to full self-driving. So essentially there's a convergence that's happening here, around subscription revenue. And that need to serve your customer post acquisition. So again, if we take a step back and think about Mutiny, it's like if we can get the right customers, give them the right content, help them through each of the points of their life cycle, you're going to essentially truly be customer centric.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple things I'm jotting down notes that you touched on there. And one of my first thoughts was that in this time of economic squeeze where companies need to find, more ways to bring in revenue, is it something like this would inspire me to almost diversify or test my target ICPs, right? Because you can think about market expansion. If you're able to set up a scenario where, if this, then that for a certain ICP, then you could be like, well, we've had some use cases. They were outliers, but let's test it. Let's see if we should go after more of that market. Let's test it in a way where we're not just throwing buckets of money into the ether. But the part that I like the most about everything you said was lifecycle, because in previous episodes, we've talked about demand generation throughout the entire funnel, from the top to the bottom. And, when one of the things that I love the most about recent marketing strategies is the life cycle and the customer success managers. Mm-hmm. So I could see how this would be super useful for them. And then my last thought about everything you said, because you said so many great things. So I, please engage on any of these points, is that things are becoming more subscription-based. I would argue that they were already subscription-based. We just weren't trained to look at them like that, right? Yep. So with the Volvo or the BMW example, it used to be that people would pick a brand and that's the hill they were going to die on. Mm-hmm. I am a BMW owner for my whole life. And, that was it. And so their subscription would be every 5 years, they would get a new vehicle from that one dealership. And that was their revolving revenue. It was just so much longer. But that's not exactly SaaS, right? That's not how SaaS works. Yeah, no. But the contract's length, you have a set amount of time, either, whether it's monthly or yearly or annually, or, for enterprise, those much larger term things, being able to retain and keep the customer and then grow it when you iterate and have new services, or maybe you pivot or whatever happens, being able to keep them is huge for keeping your business open.
Yeah, so it's the best way to grow, right? Even if you have half the amount of acquisition, but you have a 15% better retention, that after 3 years, you'll be twice the size of the other company, right? So it's just the way the math ends up working, the compound nature of it, right? It's just you really got to think about that. And there's a couple of really great leaders out there, that talk about this that I've worked with. One guy named John Cutler, really amazing product coach, and another guy named Nir Ayal, who wrote a book on habit-forming products. And habit-forming products talks a lot about that life cycle. I highly recommend anybody read that if they want to start really deeply engaging with this.
Yeah, definitely. And that's part of where, you can start to go off on a tangent about habit forming and dopamine cycles and the neuroscience of it. But that's another episode. So to kind of keep us moving forward in this conversation, what were, I kind of touched on people using this to diversify or outliers or strange use cases. What were some unique or novel ways that you've seen people use Mutiny?
Yeah, I think that one of them that we didn't necessarily anticipate was trying to understand their ICPs better. So because we have all that information to the website, some people didn't even realize, they'll look at an overall conversion rate, for example, right? So they'll look at a main call to action, right? And it could be like a sign up or a demo button or some pretty money making direct to pipeline, action. And they're not even realizing that different segments are interacting with that button differently, right? And so, for example, like we could find out if like an SMB customer that works in manufacturing, has a twice as high likelihood to convert there compared to someone who is like in professional services, that's an enterprise, right? And if you make more money off of enterprise professional services company, that means that call to action is actually a failure. But you may be thinking it's winning because you're being subsidized by the wrong segment. And so one of the things that Mutiny allows you to do is, because we're identifying these visitors, as they come in and we're looking at the conversion rates of them to serve them content, one of the byproducts of that, we can tell you what the conversion rate is by those, those unique segments, right? And so I think that's pretty interesting. And that a lot of people are, again, they're looking at like an overall generalized, maybe segmented by channel, conversion rate to make sure spend is working the right way. But to actually be able to identify your ICP through that is difficult today. And that's one of the things that we're helping people do. And so that's what we're talking about, sort of like that exodus from sort of a certain ICP to a more stable industry is a big trend that I'm seeing right now, where they're trying to double down on the companies that actually do retain. Then you look at your website and you go, oh my God, my website's not built for that. We can actually see it through the data. Now let's start putting some hypotheses out there and start testing them and start personalizing, content to those people.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the evolution of the ICP too, right? Because it's never static. You can define the ICP you may have defined 5 years ago when you're like writing your pitch for your seed round has dramatically changed, through COVID, through the economic changes and everything today. So you having that feedback to iterate and say, like, this is what's working, this is how it's evolving, I think is pretty significant for the rest of your, the rest of the marketing that's occurring, right? Especially in the case where if you have an audience and it's a button is a failure there, then you can find other opportunities.
Yeah, important to do that, because you got to understand that that one size fits all marketing strategy is not going to work. And actually it's really inefficient to do that.
Yeah. What's that saying? Like, if you speak to everyone, you're speaking to no one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Big believer of that. So let's see. I love this product so much. I love the future marketing, and when it really gets to be like the better path. I don't know. That sounds like a little like snobby. But it's data driven. It's coming at it from facts instead of just biases. And so, it once again, trying not to be like, oh yeah, Mutiny's the best thing since, sliced bread. And I know that, we've got some bias here. But there's always a situation where a strategy isn't the right fit. There's, something may not be good for one type of thing. And there's always going to be, we're good at this, but not this. Totally. What is that in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, so again, I think there's two parts of it. Number one, we're B2B, right? And so B2C is a dramatically different beast, right? It's very hard and frankly, getting harder to identify users and understand them and their past behaviors in order to serve them relevant content, unless that data is first party. So it's very important to invest in something that's like that, captures first party data, but gone are the days of like third party data being, shipped around everywhere. And depending on countries and where your markets are, like it's just a minefield, right? So for B2C, I think it's important to find ways to use first party data to serve up, relevant experiences. When it comes, so that's not something that, Mutiny really does. I think the other thing too, is that let's say that you are B2B and you have like really, really large contract sizes, but very, very, very small, ICP for yourself in a very small market that you sell into, like a niche market, you're not going to get enough relevant data points to find any statistical significance. And so, and then if you divide that audience in these smaller and smaller segments, it becomes harder and harder to drive actual data-driven decisions out of that, right? So it's kind of like on the extreme. So either one, that you're selling to millions of people and like they're humans that are not businesses, it's a lot more difficult to identify them on first visit. And then if let's say you're selling to a very small audience, you may not have an audience that you can slice and dice a million ways. And so therefore, like the data itself is not necessarily going to be driven, or not going to drive decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a really good call out, is the statistical significance. And I think that that's something that a lot of marketers that aren't trained in data don't really think about. And, before we launch into the future of, RevOps and marketing and what it should be, data and understanding how to use it correctly and what certain aspects of it are, correlation versus causation and things like that. My soapbox here is that I do think that marketers and leadership need to be trained on what that means. Like, it's not just like, oh yeah, we had, we put out like 5 blogs this week. And so, we saw an uplift. Well, did you? Like, that's not how that works exactly. Yeah. Maybe that's a good question. But where do you think the future of marketing is going?
Yeah, I think that, if we, depends on like how far in the future, right? So if we look like over the next 3, 4, 5 years, the money expensive thing is not going to go away. And you can see that there is sort of like, a refactoring of businesses by and large, at least in B2B SaaS, right? And I think that that's going to continue for at least, the next year and a half. But that doesn't mean that we don't still have growth goals, right? I mean, even in our board meeting we recently had, it was pretty funny. It was like, yeah, we don't need to grow 3x, but we still need to grow 2x. You know what I mean? So it's not like there's no growth. So I don't think that we're in a true like sky is falling situation, but we're going to have to change up tactics. And I think we're going to have to really be specific about like who we're targeting, how we're targeting, what channels work. So that puts a lot of pressure on the marketing team, which already had a lot of pressure, especially because depending on how the C-suite is, put together, we've recently seen that a lot of CMOs are reporting to a CRO now. Right. And so like now increasingly that what that's saying is that seat at that table is harder and harder to get. And we're adding all this pressure of like, well, any bet you make better be right. And the CFO doesn't want to hear it, right? Whether, if you spent all this millions of dollars and like you said, well, did it cause uplift? Because that's the first, gal that's going to say that, she's going to be like, wait a second, where did this money go? Right. And so if you aren't data driven by default, it's just your job is going to be really, really, really tough. And we see this, as, companies are growing, quite a bit over the past couple of years. Even in those high growth environments, seeing CMOs tenure, just shortening. And part of that is because, what people are looking for is that true, like, did this really cause that, right? Or is it just correlated? Or if it's correlated, how close are we to causal? And like, there's a big difference there. And I'm not the kind of person that actually is like going to be like, okay, everything has to be causal, because you can't measure everything that way. It's like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. But if you don't have confidence in your story, then that's not going to play well when you're in these conversations. And so I do think that like the future of marketing, is, even though it may seem to some people like, oh, we're already in that era, like the temperature's turned up quite a bit now. Because if you felt like you should be doing that, you knew you should be doing that, but you weren't doing that, like you're not going to be able to survive in it. And then if we look even farther, I really do think that increasingly generative AI is going to play a bigger and bigger part. I mean, you're already seeing like stories like Jasper and things like that, these companies that are just like exploding. And I think they're exploding right now because of our curiosity, not because the application has truly been refined yet, like in terms of how we apply AI into our workflows and things like that. And, that's one of the things that we're trying to tackle here at Mutiny. And I do think that sort of, how much is the, machine, how much is the man, like where are we merging, and like what is the ratio there is still yet to be determined. And so I think that's a very interesting, path. And I don't know if we're going to be able to open that box and then put that genie back in the bottle, right? Whatever analogy you want to use, Pandora's box, the genie in the bottle. But like, it's definitely coming, and it's definitely going to change, quite a bit of things. And then lastly, I think like really like one of the biggest changes is going to be that push towards product. Where the product really is the number one marketing tool. It is the sales tool. We've seen these companies that have product-led growth just explode. I do think there's a lot of hype around it, but the idea is not going away. That's going to completely, continue to change the way that we think about software companies and growth models. And so, that's sort of like short, medium, and long-term, thoughts that I have.
No, that's great. I think that you mentioned a lot of things there. My thoughts on some of the AI that exists right now is that training it to do what you need out of it takes more time than just doing it yourself. From a very pragmatic point of view, there's a difference between automation and trying to have it synthesize things. And, the synthesization of accurate information or copy is where it needs a lot of supervision.
Once you have one bad headline, you never trust it again. Right. So so it's difficult, but the rate of that change is pretty astounding right now. Like it's, you have a son, right? So go to Dolly and ask it to draw some banana basketball players. That's what I did for our kids. The rate of change is pretty aggressive right now.
Yeah, it's super impressive. It's the stuff that sci-fi is made out of from when we were like 10, 15, 20 years ago. And it's really cool. And I think that you were right that it has sparked that curiosity, and that's kind of the driver of growth there. My last response to what you said was about product-led growth and like the hype and it kind of jumping off. And the thing about all of these different models is that they always come back to the customer, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you aren't matching your product to the customer's needs, or you aren't matching everything to your target audience, then you have no one to buy it. And so even though it's called product-led growth or, whatever names that we're coming out with to rebrand things that we were already doing or growing it to a higher level of sophistication, is that it does have to be a part of that holistic strategy that is going to create growth from attracting customers. And if you piss them off, then no one's there.
Yeah.
So, wow, we've talked through so many things at such a wonderful, high level, and I super appreciate it. If someone wants to connect with you to find out more, what are some ways that they can do that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, can reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's a big, fast and easy way to get to me. And then, about my email address, that's another good way. I'm not much of a Twitter guy, things like that. I miss that boat. And it's probably safer for everybody that I'm not on Twitter. But yeah, so LinkedIn is always the fastest and best way to get a hold of me.
Great. Can you spell out your first and last name so that people know?
Yeah. So I should have added my last name on my thing. So Julio, and then my last name is Bermúdez, which is Bermudez.
Yeah, definitely want to make sure it's a Z, not an S. So you got to get the right one.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, my name's Leanne, and you can also find me on LinkedIn. It's under Leanne Dow. And then Markigy, Markigy, which was my fun way of describing my specific brand of marketing. Thanks for listening, and always remember to subscribe, and review. You've been listening to Markigy, the science of marketing strategy. If any of the strategies we talked about today inspired you to learn more, try them. Remember, the perfect strategy doesn't exist, only the one that gets done. Subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast player to make sure that you never miss an episode. Thanks for listening. Until next time.